the army that defeated the British Empire for more than 50 years. KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, 1787. In the rolling grasslands between the Drakensberg Mountains and the Indian Ocean, one of the smallest clans among the Nguni people welcomed the birth of a child who would not be claimed by his father. His mother, Nandi, was an orphan princess of the Langeni clan. His father, Senzangakona, was chief of the Zulu, a minor clan of a few thousand cattle herders. Because both parents belonged to related clans, their relationship violated custom. The child was considered a bastard. When Shaka was 6 years old, his father sent them away. For years, Shaka and his mother lived as unwanted guests among the Langeni, despised and mocked. They were eventually expelled and took refuge with the Mthethwa, the most powerful clan in the region. There, the unwanted son of a minor chief learned to fight. What no one who knew the young Shaka could have predicted was what he would become. By the time he died in 1828, he governed more than 250,000 people and could mobilize more than 50,000 warriors. In 12 years, the Zulu had gone from a clan of a few thousand to the dominant military power in southern Africa, a transformation with almost no parallel in the history of warfare. The society from which Shaka emerged was pastoral and organized by cattle ownership. The Nguni Bantu people had migrated into the region over centuries. Inter-clan conflict existed, but was traditionally limited. The outnumbered side conceded before serious casualties accumulated. War was not supposed to be decisive. Shaka made it decisive. How does a man who spent his childhood being mocked and expelled build the most feared army on an entire continent? What did he actually change about the way his people fought? And why did what he built survive not only his own assassination, but eventually stand against the most powerful military force on Earth? The answer begins with a spear. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support, and let's continue. Shaka rebuilds the spear, rewrites African warfare. KwaZulu, 1816. Within weeks of claiming the Zulu throne, supported by Dingiswayo, the Mthethwa chief who had recognized his military talent, Shaka began dismantling the way the Zulu fought and rebuilding it from the ground up. He had spent years as a warrior under Dingiswayo. He had studied what worked and what didn't. What he implemented was not incremental reform. It was a complete revolution. The first change was the weapon. Nguni warriors carried long throwing spears, which kept fighters at a distance and made engagements brief and relatively non-lethal. Shaka replaced the throwing spear with the ikolwa, a short-hafted stabbing spear with a broad, long blade. The name came from the sound the weapon made when withdrawn from a body. Warriors armed with the ikolwa could not throw their weapon and step back. They had to close with the enemy and fight at arm's length until one side was destroyed. The second change was footwear, or rather the elimination of it. Shaka banned sandals. He toughened his warriors' feet by making them run barefoot over rocky and thorny ground until they could cover 80 kilometers in a day. An impis, the Zulu war formation, consistently achieved this pace on the march, living off grain and cattle taken from villages it passed, accompanied by boys who carried sleeping mats and cooking pots. The third change was organization. Shaka dissolved existing clan allegiances and replaced them with age-grade regiments, amabuto, where young men were enrolled alongside others from all sections of the kingdom, not their home communities. Each regiment was given its own name, its own distinctive shield markings, its own kraal. Warriors identified with their regiment, not their clan of origin. Loyalty ran to Shaka personally, not to local chiefs. The fourth change was the prohibition on marriage. Warriors could not marry until Shaka gave permission, which came only after years of campaigns. This created a permanent standing army of young men with nothing to do but train and fight. The war cry was simple: victory or death. The bull's horns formation destroys every enemy. KwaZulu between 1810 and 1812. Shaka developed a battlefield tactic that would eventually become one of the most studied and feared military maneuvers in the history of African warfare. He called it the ISI squee, known in English as the bull's horns formation. Its simplicity was its genius. Its execution by a disciplined and fast-moving army was nearly impossible to counter without firearms. The available regiments were divided into 4 distinct groups, each with a separate purpose. The chest consisted of the most experienced warriors. Their role was to advance on the enemy frontally, engage directly, and fix the opposing force in place, preventing it from retreating or maneuvering. The chest fought hard and absorbed punishment to keep the enemy occupied. The horns, typically younger, faster warriors, sprinted out to encircle the enemy on both flanks simultaneously. Their mission was to run around the sides of the opposing force and close behind it, completing the encirclement. Shaka trained his warriors to cover ground at speeds that left enemy forces unable to respond before the trap closed. The loins, a large reserve of veteran fighters, was kept seated behind the chest with their backs to the battle. This was deliberate. Shaka understood that soldiers watching an intense engagement become excited and eager. By positioning the reserve facing away from the fight, he kept them calm and ready. They were committed wherever the enemy threatened to break out of the encirclement. The entire formation was supervised by indunas, officers who used hand signals to direct the regiments. No shouted commands that could cause confusion in the chaos of battle. The formation had one critical dependency: speed. Slow execution gave the enemy time to adjust, concentrate against one horn, or simply flee. Fast execution produced a closed trap before the target understood what was happening. By the time of Shaka's assassination in 1828, this tactic had destroyed more than 100 clans across southern Africa. Mafeking. Zulu expansion reshapes an entire continent. Southern Africa, 1816 to 1840. The shockwaves produced by the expanding Zulu military machine traveled in all directions, not as a single displacement, but as a chain reaction that historians would eventually call the Mfecane in Nguni languages, or Difakane in Sotho. The words translate roughly as the crushing or the scattering. They describe what happened to dozens of communities that lay in the path of Zulu expansion or were struck by the ripple effects of displaced peoples colliding with other peoples. King Mzilikazi had been a general in Shaka's army. He fell out with Shaka over cattle tribute, fled north with his followers, and eventually established a new kingdom in what is today Zimbabwe. His people became the Ndebele, a warrior nation built on Zulu military principles, speaking a related language and practicing the same age regiment system. The Basotho, under the exceptional leadership of King Moshoshu III, gathered refugees from the shattered plains communities and built a new nation in the Maluti Mountains, a kingdom that survived both the Mfecane and later European colonization. That nation is today the independent country of Lesotho. The Swazi consolidated under pressure from Zulu power into a kingdom that survived by a combination of military resistance and diplomatic skill. The grassland plains of Natal, which would appear largely empty to Voortrekker Boers arriving in the 1830s, had been emptied by the disruptions of the Mfecane. Communities that had occupied these lands for generations had been destroyed, absorbed, or driven elsewhere. Shaka was assassinated on September 22, 1828, by his half-brothers Dingain and Mlangana, along with an Induna named Bopa. The motive was his increasingly erratic and brutal behavior, including the execution of approximately 7,000 Zulus after the death of his mother Nandi in 1827. Dingaan became king of a nation that had already reshaped an entire continent. Blood River, rifles stopped 10,000 charging warriors. Mgungundlovu, Zulu Royal Kraal, February 6, 1838. Voortrekker leader Piet Retief and 67 of his men arrived at the Royal Kraal of King Dingaan to finalize a land deal in Natal. They had fulfilled the condition Dingaan had set, recovering cattle stolen by another chief. Dingaan invited them inside for a farewell celebration and asked that they leave their weapons at the entrance. They complied. Once the party was inside the enclosure, Dingaan stood and shouted, "Kill the wizards!" His warriors attacked immediately. Retief and all 67 men were taken to the execution hill of Matiwain and killed. That same night, Dingana sent his regiments to attack Voortrekker encampments along the Bushman's River in what became known as the Weenen Massacre, Weenen being the Dutch word for to weep. Zulu warriors killed approximately 534 settlers, including women and children. The surviving Voortrekkers chose a new commander, Andries Pretorius. On the morning of December the 16th, 1838, Pretorius positioned 464 armed men and approximately 600 black allies in a defensive laager, a circular formation of 64 wagons, on the bank of the Encome River, with a steep ravine protecting two sides. Between 10,000 and 15,000 Zulu warriors attacked. The defenders had muskets and 2 cannons. The Zulu charged repeatedly. Each charge was met with concentrated fire from men who did not need to move while they shot. Approximately 3,000 Zulus were killed. The waters of the Encome River ran red with blood, giving it the name by which the battle would be remembered, Blood River. The Voortrekkers suffered 0 deaths. 3 were lightly wounded. Dingaan burned his royal kraal and fled north. He was assassinated near the border of what is today Eswatini. His half-brother Mpande became king of a Zulu nation that had been dramatically weakened, surrounded now by both Boer republics and a growing British colonial presence. Britain delivers an impossible ultimatum. War becomes inevitable. Natal, December 1878. King Cetshwayo Kampande had governed the Zulu kingdom since 1872. He was, by every contemporary British account that did not have a political motive, a reasonable and thoughtful ruler who had regarded the British as his friends. He had maintained the Zulu military system, approximately 40,000 disciplined warriors organized in age-grade regiments, because the military system was the state. Dismantling the army meant dismantling the kingdom. That was precisely what the British High Commissioner for Southern Africa, Sir Henry Bartle Frere, wanted. Frere's goal was a confederation of southern African territories under British control, similar to what Lord Carnarvon had achieved in Canada with the British North America Act of 1867. The Zulu Kingdom was the last major independent African power in the region. Its existence and its army threatened the stability of the adjacent British colonies of Natal and the Transvaal. In December 1878, Frere delivered an ultimatum to Cetshwayo with conditions the king could not possibly meet without destroying his own political authority. Disband the army, accept a British resident at his court, and surrender specific individuals accused of border violations. The deadline was 30 days. There was one additional complication. Frere had not obtained approval from the British government in London before issuing the ultimatum. The cabinet was not fully briefed. Frere acted unilaterally. Cetewayo did not respond to the ultimatum. He could not respond in any way that would satisfy it. On January 11th, 1879, Lord Chelmsford crossed the Buffalo River at Rorke's Drift with the British center column. He commanded approximately 7,800 troops in 3 invasion columns. His previous campaigns in southern Africa had been easy victories over technologically inferior opponents. He had been strongly advised by Boer settlers who had extensive experience fighting the Zulu never to engage them in open terrain without a fortified position. He ignored that advice. 20,000 warriors sit silent in a valley. Valley of Mwebeni, Zulu land, morning of January 22nd, 1879. A troop of British mounted scouts crested a ridge and chased a small group of Zulus over the lip of a valley. The scouts pulled their horses up short. Sitting in total silence on the valley floor below them were approximately 20,000 Zulu warriors. It was the main Zulu army, mobilized by Cetewayo on a scale not seen since the reign of Shaka. The army was organized into its traditional age-grade regiments, distinguished by the markings on their cowhide shields. The commanders were the senior chiefs, Anshinwayo Kamahole, Koza, and Mavumengwana Kandlela Ntuli. They had planned to attack the next day, January 23rd. The accidental discovery by the British scouts forced them into action 12 hours early. Lord Chelmsford had left the British camp at the foot of Isandlwana Hill that same morning with a substantial force, pursuing what he believed was the main Zulu army in a completely different direction. He had been deliberately misled by Zulu commanders who understood that dividing the British force was essential to their tactical plan. Left defending the camp were approximately 1,300 British, colonial, and African auxiliary troops under Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pauline. The camp was not laggard. The wagons that could have provided a defensive circle sat in their columns, unhitched. Multiple officers had noted the vulnerability and suggested the camp be fortified. The suggestion had not been implemented. The Zulu army came over the plateau edge and descended toward the camp in the bull's horns formation. The chest advanced frontally. The left horn ran to cut off the escape route to Natal. The right horn moved to close behind the camp from the opposite direction. At approximately 11 o'clock in the morning, the British infantry formed extended lines on the plain below Isandlwana Hill and opened fire with their Martini Henry rifles. Isandlwana. Spears destroy Britain's most advanced rifles. Isandlwana, Zululand, January 22, 1879. The Martini Henry rifle was the most advanced infantry weapon in the world. It was a breech-loading single-shot weapon that fired a large caliber lead bullet that flattened on impact, causing catastrophic tissue damage. A trained British soldier could fire 12 aimed rounds per minute. The camp at Isandlwana also had 2 7-pounder mountain guns and a hail rocket battery. The Zulu warriors were armed primarily with the ikalwa, the short stabbing spear, cowhide shields, and throwing spears. Some carried antiquated muskets and rifles of various types, poorly maintained and with limited ammunition. Their marksmanship training was minimal. Their firearm advantage was negligible. For a time, the British fire was effective. The extended lines of infantry poured sustained volleys into the approaching formations. But the camp was not fortified. The British line was stretched more than a mile across open plain, with no protection behind it. And there were 20,000 warriors. The Zulu left horn reached the escape route to Natal first, cutting off retreat. The right horn closed behind the camp. The chest continued its frontal assault. When the British line finally broke under pressure, in some places from ammunition supply failures, in others simply from the weight of numbers, There was nowhere to go. The Zulus went through the camp, fighting hand to hand. The battle lasted approximately 4 hours from start to finish. When it ended, more than 1,300 British soldiers and auxiliaries were dead, including 52 officers. More officers than were lost in all 3 major battles of the Waterloo Campaign combined. Zulu casualties are estimated between 1,000 and 3,000, a fraction of the force that had attacked. When Cetshwayo received the news, he was reported to have said, "An assegai has been thrust into the belly of the nation." The news reached London on February 11th, 1879. It was, the Times of London reported, the most shocking military disaster in a generation. Rorke's Drift, 150 men hold forever. Rorke's Drift, Natal, afternoon of January 22nd, 1879. While the camp at Isandlwana was still being overrun, approximately 4,000 Zulu warriors under Dabulamanzi Kampande, King Cetshwayo's brother, crossed the Buffalo River into British-held Natal and turned toward the small mission station at Rorke's Drift, which served as the supply depot for Chelmsford's center column. Defending the station were approximately 150 British soldiers and colonial troops, many of them sick or wounded patients in the mission hospital. Lieutenant John Chard of the Royal Engineers and Lieutenant Gonville Bromhead of the 24th Regiment of Foot took command. They had perhaps 2 hours of warning from survivors fleeing Isandlwana. In that time, they built barricades using mealie bags, large sacks of grain, and biscuit boxes stacked between the 2 buildings of the station. They loopholed the walls of the hospital and the storehouse. They pulled wagons across gaps. The position was far from ideal, but it was fortified. The Zulus attacked in late afternoon and pressed the assault through the night. They set fire to the hospital roof. Fighting moved room to room inside the burning building as defenders and patients moved through walls they had broken with their bare hands, carrying the wounded. Warriors reached the barricades and fought over them with spears against bayonets at ranges of less than a meter. The station held. By dawn, the Zulus withdrew, leaving more than 500 dead or wounded within sight of the barricades. 15 British soldiers were killed. When Chelmsford's column returned that morning, expecting to find another massacre, they found 150 men standing in a position carpeted with Zulu dead. 11 Victoria Crosses were awarded for the defense of Rorke's Drift, the largest number ever given for a single action in British military history. The defense became legendary in Britain within weeks, but in London, it was the news from Isandlwana that changed everything. Ulundi burns, but the Zulu nation survives. Ulundi, Zululand, July 4th, 1879. The reinforced British Army, now numbering more than 17,000 troops, the largest force Britain had ever sent to Africa, had spent 5 months methodically advancing through Zululand. They lagered every night. They entrenched every camp. They had learned what open terrain without fortification cost at Isandlwana. In March, at the Battle of Kambula, approximately 22,000 Zulu warriors had attacked a fully entrenched and lagered British position. The result was decisive. The Zulus were repelled with heavy casualties. Artillery and disciplined rifle fire from behind fortifications destroyed the Bull's Horns formation that had been so lethal at Isandlwana. On July 4th, the British column reached Ulundi, Cetshwayo's capital. The Zulu army made its final stand. The British formed a large infantry square, the classic formation that no lightly armed infantry could penetrate when sustained rifle fire was maintained from all 4 sides. The Zulu regiments charged in their traditional formation. They were met with artillery and concentrated volleys. Ulundi was burned to the ground. On August 28, 1879, Cetshwayo was captured near the Drakensberg Mountains and sent into exile in Cape Town. He was later brought to London, where his dignified bearing won him the sympathy of the British public. Queen Victoria ordered him restored to his throne in January 1883. He returned to a fractured kingdom, was attacked by rival chiefs empowered by the British during the partition, and died in February 1884. Zululand was formally annexed by Britain in 1887. It was incorporated into the Union of South Africa in 1910. The Zulu nation today numbers approximately 11 to 12 million people. isiZulu is one of South Africa's 11 official languages. The Battle of Isandlwana is studied in military academies worldwide as the most decisive defeat of a modern army by a traditionally armed indigenous force in the history of European colonialism. The warriors who sat in silence in the valley of Ngwebeni on the morning of January 22, 1879, and charged a camp of modern rifles with spears, and won, are not forgotten.